recognize the ranking member for opening statement. I yield to the ranking member for an opening statement. I yield back.
Good morning, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Distinguished gentlelady from California, Mary Bono. Gentlelady is recognized.
Chair now recognizes
the lady from California is recognized.
I'm pleased to introduce Congresswoman Mary Bono, former U.S. Representative for California's Inland Empire and Desert Region from 1998 to 2013.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Hello and welcome to Sagely Speaking. I am delighted to have Chris McGreal with us today for this episode. Chris is a foreign correspondent for The Guardian. He has covered Africa, the Middle East, and Central America, but he's now based in the U.S., and he has won awards for his coverage of Africa, Israel, and the U.S. In fact, in 2002, he was awarded the James Cameron Prize for his coverage of Africa. It was said that his work as a journalist combined moral vision and professional integrity. And that's what I like about Chris McGreal. Now, when I met him, he was working on a book called American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. Now, I was just lamenting with him. This goes back to 2018, and how hopefully our memories are pretty sharp about 2018. But nonetheless, the issue that he covered, of course, the overdose, the opioid epidemic, lingers on to today. In fact, it's worse today. It's more to some degree. But what I liked about Chris and his journalistic style, again, he had a combined moral vision and professional integrity. Chris, welcome to Sagely Speaking.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for having me on.
You have the perfect BBC voice. And in fact, you started with a BBC local radio show, and now here you are, a radio, I guess, coverage as a journalist, and now here you are covering even American politics as a spectator, and what a wild ride that is, I'm sure. But let's go back to 2018 and your book. You called it The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts, which I thought was very clever that you had seen it, sort of the precursor, the build-up, and then the follow-up. Of course, you labeled those differently. But what encouraged you to go on and write this book just about the opioid epidemic in the U.S.?
It actually came out of a series I wrote for The Guardian not long after I'd arrived in the United States in 2009, I think 2 or 3 years later. I was looking at the US Census, and I noticed among sort of smallish towns, I think above 25,000 residents, the poorest towns all were very, very different. They all actually were quite racially homogenous from each other, different from each other, but racially homogenous in their own way. And I thought it would be very interesting to look at what these towns, cities, small cities had in common and what their differences were, and why, the problems they shared and what they were doing about it. And one of the small cities I went to was Beattyville in eastern Kentucky. And it became clear from talking to the mayor that their major issue was the opioid epidemic, which wasn't something I'd heard about in the other towns, which were Black or Native American or Latino. And even his own daughter had been prosecuted for dealing in the drugs whilst working in a pharmacy. And he felt that this was a huge blight on the whole region he was working in. And I started to dig into what was going on. And as time went by, it occurred to me that really this was a uniquely American problem, a uniquely American epidemic. You weren't seeing it in other countries. And I wondered why. And that's what prompted me to write the book, is I set out to answer that question. Why does America have an opioid epidemic and nobody else really does?
So it took you far and away from that small little town and that one mayor, and you uncovered the complex, vast problem that it was. I don't want to say network because it wasn't a network, but I say to this day, you could teach college courses on everything that went wrong, the greed, the corruption. And you uncovered that slowly. And in your book, you name names and you don't pull your punches. You actually go right down into naming people, including members of Congress, both good and bad or complicit and helpful, but also with pharmaceutical companies. What was the response to that? Did you have any horse heads in your bed?
No, I did get quite a lot of threats, and you won't be surprised, particularly from the lawyers for the Sackler family, who have continued to send out threats, even though they're in the legal position they're in, and you'd think that they would have given up by now. Mostly, you get blanked. Actually, they simply refuse to engage. I was the organization I was most surprised by that just really refused to engage in any detail beyond blank statements was the Food and Drug Administration, which plays a central role in this. But I think their whole approach was just if we don't talk about it, if we just block this, then we won't have to deal with the issue. And I was able to get officials eventually to talk, and former officials in particular. But as an institution, the FDA was singularly uncooperative. The drug companies, they had for many years, as you well know from your time in Congress, been spinning a line that the issue were the people that became addicted rather than the drugs themselves and how they were marketed and the whole kind of complex setup of pushing opioids as a first line of pain treatment. So they were blaming the victims, essentially. And that was their primary strategy in dealing with me, was to criminalize and blame the victims.
Well, it's an easy target, I think, to swat at Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers, but my beef really is how many governmental agencies have some role in this, and we're complicit in this, and you've mentioned the FDA. But what took so long, in your estimation, for the agencies to respond, for them to recognize that this was a problem? And look, this is not just governmental. It's also the AMA. It's others. And the response was so slow. And what concerns me is, will this happen again? So what does it take? What is the wake-up call in our country when people go, wow, things are really, really haywire, and we better fix this now? And that was the point. What I liked about your reporting is I'm hopeful that people just get it. We can never allow this to occur.
Well, just to pick up your initial point about the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma, I completely agree with you. It's very convenient, particularly for the industry today, to load it all onto one bad apple. And that's not to diminish the part that Purdue and the Sackler family played. For sure, they played a very, very important role. But they weren't the only villains. And it's very convenient for the other villains to pretend that this is just one bad apple. I think one of the things that was very striking to me was that actually the threat of an epidemic, the danger of these drugs, was recognized very early on by some very courageous doctors, as it turned out. I'm thinking of doctors like Art Van Zee, who was or remains a doctor in Virginia, northwestern Virginia, who saw the impact of OxyContin, which was really the drug that kicked all of this off early on. I think of Dr. Jane Ballantyne, who was head of pain at Harvard University and at its associated hospital, Massachusetts General. They were ringing the alarm bells very early on and saying, listen, let's pause this idea that these drugs can just be distributed widely and prescribed for anybody who has pain, particularly those with chronic pain. We're now seeing, rather than them improving people's lives, we're seeing an initial improvement, but then we're seeing the long-term issues start to kick in: dependency, full addiction, a diminishing quality of life. And that's in the early 2000s. And that's the moment, really, where had the CDC, had the FDA, had other institutions, the American Medical Association, others taken notice, I think we would have put a very early stop to this issue, this problem. What you see instead is the industry pushes back very hard, led by Purdue Pharma, but by other drug companies, in association with organizations they've effectively taken over and used as front groups. So Pain Society, the American Pain Society, and all the rest. They then turn this round and they start to vilify the doctors that are warning, and they essentially say that these doctors are going to take away important drugs that people need. They create the myth of an epidemic of untreated pain in this country that required these powerful opioids. And the pushback comes in several ways, but one of the most important was in Congress. So early on, you see hearings, and there were members of Congress who pushed, who were aware what was going on. Art Van Zee went and testified before Congress several times. But the industry, again, they turn it round. They bring in doctors who are essentially on their payroll, who've got a lot of letters behind their name to tell members of Congress that these drugs are essential. So you see this equivocation on the part of Congress, and then you see some members of Congress who are simply, to be honest, influenced by the lobby's money. They take it and they either keep quiet or they speak up for the drug industry. You see Senator Christopher Dodd, a Democrat from Connecticut, where Purdue Pharma is headquartered. If you look at the testimony from the hearings that he sat in on, he vilifies doctors like Art Van Zee for their criticism of these drugs. So you really get several years of the industry very effectively saying, we cannot take these drugs away from people who need them just because these abusers are getting addicted. And again, they blame the victim and make out that these are two separate groups of people, which often they're not. The people who come to abuse drugs are those who often are first prescribed them because they've been told that this is a good way to deal with their chronic pain.
Chris, I do follow you on social media. I'm a fan of your style. I'm a fan of your work. But do you believe this was different than the ordinary trappings of Congress? Whether that it was the opioid epidemic, but Congress regulates telecommunications, the defense industry so much. This, though, got so out of control. Is it different, or do you see this as sort of business as usual for the Congress, that the Congress just misses huge opportunities and huge problems because they have special interests in their pocket? Was this one worse than business as normal?
Well, I think it was definitely worse because of the toll, right? We've now got something around 750,000 people or 800,000 people who've died already. And by some estimates, there'll be at least another 1 million before this is over. So in that sense, yes, it's worse. And I think it's perhaps worse in another way too, because it went on for so long before there was action. And that action really didn't come from Congress in the end. It came from the CDC initially. And you do see Congress eventually get on board, partly pushed by some members of Congress like Hal Rogers, whose district was very badly affected in eastern Kentucky, and he kept ringing the alarm until somebody took notice. But I think in broad terms, yes. I mean, we see this. I guess there's been over the many years since the Reagan era, really, a weakening of oversight of regulation, and Congress has played its role in that. I think you can look at what's happening now with Boeing and the FAA. I think there's, Boeing's problems are, in the eyes of some former members of the people who've worked for that company, they see the weakening of oversight and regulation by the FAA over the years as having allowed Boeing to go down a path of lower safety standards. And you've seen the consequences with crashes and problems with their planes. And I think the drug industry was allowed to have too much control over what should have been regulation. And I think you see it in one particular area with the FDA, which is that you see the finances change. And what happens is that the drug industry starts to pay essentially for the licensing of for the approval of their drugs. So the departments in the FDA that approve those drugs start to rely on that income from those drug companies in order to fund those departments. And you can see over the years what develops is a client relationship where essentially the drug companies become the clients of the FDA rather than the FDA really being a proper oversight organization. There are other problems, the revolving door between FDA officials moving over to the drug industry, including the official that approved OxyContin. But there are a number of things here. But yes, you can see similar circumstances, but I don't think the consequences were as grave as they've often, they've obviously proven to be with the opioid epidemic.
And this is why I like to focus on this so much, because I think the government and the Congress is not above this sort of failure again. And unpacking what went wrong, I held hearings, and Hal Rogers and I created the Prescription Drug Abuse Caucus. the night before my hearing, some of my colleagues would be at fundraisers with, with the people we were going to have conversations about the next day in this hearing. So it was very acute. And I think the difference, though, when members finally got on board, it was the very sad fact that people were dying every single day in their congressional district, and people were beginning to talk about it. When I first started the work in about 2007 or 8, I would slide over stories about somebody who had died in somebody's congressional district, and that member of Congress would simply ignore it because it was just a story in a paper. And eventually it really became constituents reaching out who were in grief, and it became a tidal wave across America, a very sad tidal wave, tragic that so many people were dying. But finally, members of Congress could no longer ignore this. And I'm sure that some of those fundraisers became very uncomfortable for members and pharmaceutical lobbyists, who, by the way, they do good work too. I'm not going to sit here and say they don't do good work. They do. But in this case, we need to avoid this and make sure it never happens again in any industry. We'll continue with our interview in a moment, but first I'd like to thank my sponsors. Lucy Pet Foods is the leader in gut health. Their formulas for life feature prebiotic, balanced fiber that nourishes your dog and cat's total health. Every purchase helps support the Lucy Pet Foundation, a 501c3 charity helping animals. Save 15% off your first order and use the promo code SAGELYSPEAKING, all one word, and you will get free shipping at lucypetfoods.com. If you're committed to tackling the opioid and addiction crises, then you need to be at the 2025 RX Summit. Use code SAGELY, that's SAGELY, for an extra $100 off. Join top experts and professionals as we share strategies for prevention, deflection, treatment, and recovery. Don't miss this chance to be part of the change. Head over to rx-summit.com to register now. That's rx-summit.com for an additional $100 off. And a thank you to Mothers Against Prescription Drug Abuse, driving solutions to prevent drug abuse and overdose deaths by focusing on prevention through education and awareness. Go to mapta.net for more information. And now, back to our interview. So, Chris, right now you're moving on to the next spectator sport, just the American political landscape, and your observations there. We talked about it a little bit before we started recording. I try to keep this podcast G-rated, but I have to use the terminology. It's a shit show. And you're out there, you've been on the stump, you've been on the campaign, and you're talking to the American people. Is my assessment correct? You can clean up my words. Give me some journalistic word, a thesaurus word for shit show that doesn't violate. My producer's probably, her head's probably spinning right now, but.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about America is it's such a huge country, and there's so much going on in different places. And I mean, I'm just back from Pennsylvania, where you've got one story going on. You go to Michigan, and it's another. And I think in Arizona, it's another. Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure whether I would describe it as a shit show or not. It just seems to me this is American politics, and it's been like this ever since I arrived in this country. I arrived in 2009. Obama was
it's your fault.
In office. Yes, was just in office, and you automatically, almost soon after I got here, we saw the rise of the Tea Party, which seemed to be quite chaotic in its own way, and I think it's fair to say things have only got more chaotic as time goes by, but that's American politics for you.
Well, it's definitely elevated to a new level, I think, for sure. But I do enjoy following you, and this is my comparison. When I read the reviews of your book, American Overdose, what they say, what the blurbs about you say, I think hold true, whether it's American politics or the opioid crisis and the failures there. It says, American Overdose confirms Chris McGreal's stature as one of the truly essential reporters of our times. It is, in its investigative depth and documentary breadth, a riveting and urgent reckoning of colossal corruption that has taken such a staggering toll on 21st century American life. And this is why, like your style and what you do with your investigative journalism, that you move around with, this is sort of your ethos. This is what you're looking at. This is what you're doing. And you can move from the opioid epidemic into a conversation about Boeing and then American politics. Can you tell us a little bit about, you work for The Guardian. Now, I've sent The Guardian some money. They do ask people to support I do it because of you. But The Guardian, can you tell us a little bit about The Guardian and why you work for The Guardian?
Oh, well, I work for The Guardian because for me, it feels like a natural home. The Guardian's been around now for a couple of hundred years, or maybe it's 150. We had a big birthday recently, but I can't remember which one it was.
Just a long time.
Yeah, a lot longer than I've been around. And it's a liberal newspaper. It has a kind of liberal tradition in Britain. The newspapers in Britain tend to be more political. You've got a lot of newspapers, most of which come out of London, and they're all kind of competing, and so they tend to take positions. And it's not so much a political position; it's just a subject matter focus. Often, what are they more likely to write about? The Guardian's more likely to write about poverty than, say, the Telegraph is. So, and to me, it's always felt like a newspaper with a social conscience. I joined The Guardian in 1992 when I was based in South Africa for another British newspaper during the transition from apartheid to democracy. And then I spent the next 10 years running around Africa, writing about a very interesting decade on that continent. A lot of hope, but also a lot of conflict. And The Guardian was a newspaper that was interested and is interested still in what happens in Africa, much more so than a lot of other papers. So that was good. And then I was based in the Middle East, based in Jerusalem during the Second Intifada, during the terrible suicide bombing campaign in Israel, and then the conflict in Gaza and the West Bank, which was a tough time in many ways. I had small children, and living in Jerusalem at that point with small children and suicide bombers is a complicated business. But again, I think that The Guardian, as you will well know, not just in America, but everywhere, being a journalist covering Israel is a complex business. A lot of people have very strong opinions on all sides. And The Guardian was very willing to stand up to pressure, I would say, very supportive of its correspondents, including me. And so it's always just felt like a natural home. And then when Obama came to power, they asked me if I wanted to be the Washington correspondent, which I went off to Washington in 2009. I will say that I on a personal level, that was perhaps less interesting to me than I thought it was going to be. I did that job for 4 years, but much more interesting was seeing the rest of America and talking to ordinary Americans about it, because what you see in Washington is its own planet. It doesn't really... I was more interested in the consequences of Washington on the rest of America. So that's what I've been doing ever since.
Well, that's the perfect lens to look at things through. Well, a lot of times, my husband can be a little critical of the French, and he loves to pick on Paris especially. And I say, viewing France and all the people of France as if everybody viewed us as Americans as all New Yorkers. It's not fair. But this brings up something important to me, Chris. I am not liberal. As you know, I served as a Republican in the House for almost 15 years. But I love reading a lot of different sources, a lot of different opinions, and I like to form my own. And I'm not able to do that if I don't read both sides or all sides. Maybe there's not both. Nothing's black and white. But I think it's important to listen to different opinions and observations. And again, you're reporting on the ground from these places that I would never dare venture, especially at wartime, at a difficult time. So I think for my listeners, this is one of the things that I talk about a lot. I talked about it with Bo Kilmer from Rand Corporation. People need to read more and form their opinions themselves rather than being talked to and being fed things that feed their dopamine and get them all riled up on one political stance or another, because we're at a critical time right now in our country. I think the world, actually, we've become more opinionated, we've become angrier, and less willing to talk to the other side.
I think that's absolutely true. And it's one of the things I've noticed in America, although it's not unique to the US, is over the past 15 years that I've been here, increasingly an increasing unwillingness to listen to other people's points of view. Just consider them an automatic rejection of something, views that you don't like or you don't want to hear, and obviously social media has made that easier. Although conversely, social media also opens up a lot of paths to alternative views if you want to go look at them. And some of those are perfectly kind of reasonably. It's not all just extreme views, but you have to make the effort and you have to be willing and have an open mind. And I do think that it doesn't really matter. It's not a generational thing. It's not necessarily a political position thing. It's just a broad closing of the mind in large parts of America, not by everybody at all, but by significant numbers of people. And it's. I was just at a Trump rally in Pennsylvania, and, amongst some of his supporters, they do not want to hear a question that challenges their view. They become very aggressive just about the idea that you would be asking that question, which is unfortunate because, they could answer the question perfectly reasonably.
Do you think they could?
Depends on who they are. Some live in a fantasy world in which any alternative point of view is simply a lie. But there are others who you can ask reasonable questions of.
And I'm assuming that's at a Harris rally as well, both sides, because they're, again, so entrenched in this and so opinionated and firm in their views. But it's just too bad that this coarsening of America is occurring, that we're taking thought out of these problems. Because we have plenty of problems and we need to look at them from all sides. And maybe I'll come at the solution from a conservative point of view and you'll come from a liberal point of view. But maybe we'll actually find common ground and get something done.
I tell you where this has become clearest recently for me is that because I was based in Israel for 5 years, I continue to write about it from the American perspective. And in the present conflict, there's a section on both sides that doesn't want to hear about the suffering of the other side. So there is a pro-Palestinian section, not by all means everybody, but doesn't want to talk about the hostages, because to talk about the hostages, to humanize the hostages, in some way legitimizes what Israel's doing in Gaza in their eyes. And conversely, some of the people that are very pro-Israel don't want to talk about the scale of Palestinian civilian deaths or the legitimacy of the scale of Israel's military action, because they see that as somehow defending terrorism or support for Hamas or whatever. Whereas, it's perfectly possible to see the suffering on both sides and listen to it. And in fact, there's a group of, I live in New York right now, and there's a group of Israelis who go down to Bryant Park in Manhattan every Sunday evening, and they protest on behalf of both the Palestinians who are dying and the hostages who are being held by Hamas and the people who died inside Israel during the Hamas attack. And one of the reasons they hold that protest is that they say that both sides reject them often because they want to hear it. And so that's a really clear, to me, example now of how people won't listen to each other.
Do you believe this is being driven by leadership on down?
Yeah, I think there's a political element to it for sure. I mean, I think on both sides, there's there are extreme views on both sides, and it's not necessarily emanating from America, but it's certainly assisted by some people in America, for sure.
Well, I know a lot of us have great hope that any debates that occur will be based on policy and solutions and truly flush out whether it's Vice President Harris or former President Trump, but that they flush out really their policy positions and let the American people decide on that instead of some of the stuff that we're being thrown and that has nothing to do with policy whatsoever. But I want to get back to the book a little bit, Chris, because again, I think it's a portrait of you, these reviews. And again, I probably would disagree with a lot of how you see things for whatever reason, and that's okay. And you would disagree with me, and that's okay. But, the reviews, again, this goes back to people who are students of the opioid crisis. there's one specific blurb that says, with great reporting and compelling storytelling, American Overdose lays bare the tragedy of the opioid epidemic tearing at the soul of the United States. Those who want to understand the issue of narcotics and addiction have to read it. And this goes on and on and on, this sort of thing. So what I enjoyed, again, was your liberal background, my conservative, but we came together and saw these problems very much the same way, and the solutions, or the beginning to the solutions in much the same way too. How can people find you on social media to listen to you, on Twitter or wherever? What is your best platform, and how can they find you?
I should spend more time on social media, to be honest. I mean, I it's the nature of being a reporter that most of what I express is through my reporting. That's the and so if you go to The Guardian and search Chris McGreal, there's a page there that you can follow me, so that everything that I write, you get a notification about, and everything that I've written is up on that page. I am on Twitter as @Chris McGreal. I have to say that's mostly me tweeting either the stories I've written or occasionally links to other people's stories. I tend not to express a lot of personal views on Twitter or get into long debates with people. The nature of reporting is, as I say, that you let the reporting do the talking. And I was once on Facebook, but that was... I don't think I posted anything there in a long time, and it would mostly be pictures of my kids, I think. So that's the extent of my social media involvement, I'm afraid.
Well, that's okay. I do keep track of you, and that's how I find out when you've written something new, and I appreciate it. And again, I want to remind people, if you want to read about the opioid crisis, again, not just what happened with it, but why everything went wrong, where things fell apart. Sort of unraveling the sock through one thread at a time, unraveling the yarn here, because we should do better than we did. And I'm pointing mostly at the government on this. But again, so you can find Chris's book still on Amazon or probably elsewhere. I only go to Amazon. I'm an Amazonite, I suppose. American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts by Chris McGreal is a good read. I encourage you to pick it up and read it. Yes, 2018, but this is evergreen, and it is still a great book. So, Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I know you did include me in your book in a few spots, and we did a show together promoting it a long time ago. And I, at that time, considered you a friend. I'm just weird like that. I just collect people as my friends. So you're in my friend bucket. You're in my friend bucket. That means I'll call you more often for favors, I suppose, like coming on Sagely Speaking. But I want to thank you very much for your work and for joining me today.
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be on your show.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank you all for listening. Thank you. Thank you. And a special thank you to my sponsors. I could not do this without you. And until we meet again, my Sagely Speaking friends, I wish you all things good.